guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 41 of the American Pageant, titled The American People Face a New Century, from 2001 to 2014. We're going to be using the 16th edition of the American Pageant. If you have an earlier or a later edition, or a completely different textbook, don't worry about it, the content's going to be the same. Here are the key concepts for this chapter. These are basically just going to serve as the takeaways. What I like to do is match the key terms to each of the bullet points, and it really helps me organize the information. I highly recommend you do it, but if you don't, that's fine. So first off, well, I don't really know where to put this information. This is a little blurb that comes before the chapters, so I didn't really know where to put this, but there was a key term in it, so I figured it was important. And basically what it said was, following the 9/11 attacks, President Bush claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, or WMD, in order to justify the invasion of Iraq. And as the name suggests, these weapons were nuclear, chemical, and/or biologic warfare that had a large radius of impact. However, when they invade Iraq, no WMD are found, and the invasion, along with tax cuts and a weak economy, plunged the federal budget back into deficits. And later on, President Barack Obama, who is the first African-American president in U.S. history, inherits the impending economic crisis in 2008, known as the Great Recession, and created healthcare reforms and financial regulation reforms. These reforms triggered massive political partisanship, at one point resulting in a government shutdown in 2013. And currently it is 2020. We unfortunately do not have Obama with us anymore during this world pandemic, but what can you do? So now let's talk about George W. Bush. He won people over with his down-to-earth charm despite having degrees from Harvard and Yale, and proved to be a strong advocate for conservative causes. He even withdrew support from international programs that supported abortion and limited research into embryonic stem cells, which could help cure diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, because he believed it was killing human life at the embryonic stage. And this shows the ethical conflicts that arose with various advances in science. It's like the story of Frankenstein. Yeah, you could bring a human back to life, but should you? I would argue that cells are a bit less complicated, but that's for another day. He also angered environmentalists by trying to dismantle Clinton-era reforms that limited the amount of arsenic levels in drinking water. Additionally, he rejected the Kyoto Treaty, which was a major international effort to limit greenhouse gas emissions in order to slow the rate of global warming. He further sparked criticism when he allowed his Vice President Cheney to secretly create energy policies while consulting with oil companies. And this shows you how a lot of his domestic policies were very pro-business and corporate-oriented. So now, on a more serious note, let's talk about 9/11. This is a devastating attack in 2001 where suicidal terrorists hijacked 2 airplanes and crashed them into New York City's World Trade Center. A 3rd airplane is crashed at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and a 4th plane, with the help of heroic passengers on board the hijacked plane, was forcibly crashed into rural Pennsylvania with relatively minimal fatalities. Overall, the attack led to the deaths of 3,000 innocent Americans, including hundreds of firefighters and other rescue officials. Meanwhile, people who were or even just looked Middle Eastern were often targeted and considered terrorists as a result, increasing xenophobic and racist sentiments domestically. A week later, Bush gave a speech consoling the nation while informing them that although he respects the Muslim faith, the radical Islamist group Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, was the key perpetrator in the attacks. And keep in mind that bin Laden resented America's power and their large influence in the Middle East, which made them a key target. In response to 9/11, a massive military campaign was organized to find bin Laden in Afghanistan, so now the US has found a new focus for foreign policy. Additionally, new counterterrorism tactics like intelligence training took greater influence domestically, and this shows the permanent impact this attack had on America. These attacks, coupled with the recession, crippled the American economy. Another result of the attacks is the Department of Homeland Security, which is established to protect the nation's borders and gather intelligence on potential future attacks. And again, this illustrates the generational impact that 9/11 had on the nation and foreign relations, which set a base from which the US could establish their new foreign policy. They have a new external threat. It's no longer about the containment of communism, it's about radical Islamists and potential attacks domestically. So more on the impact of 9/11, you have the USA Patriot Act, which is also the name of a very good TV show on Netflix that I highly recommend you watch. But this Patriot Act allowed for immense phone and email surveillance and allowed for immigrants who were suspected terrorists to be deported. And this shows how fear plagued American society following the attacks and allowed for a greater role of the federal government in establishing what could be considered invasive measures. Meanwhile, abroad, you have the Guantanamo detention camp, where Taliban fighters captured in Afghanistan were placed, and similarly, immigrants were held without habeas corpus, which meant they were detained for formal charges without an explanation as to why they were being held. Another thing Bush does is put suspected terrorists before military tribunals, which, unlike normal trials, didn't have stringent rules for evidence and procedure. And all these measures prompted debates among the American public as to the validity of these drastic measures, since it meant the encroachment of civil liberties. And finally, in 2002, Bush declared Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as national security threats, although he focused heavily on Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq at the time. And this starts plans for a war against Iraq, which shows the use of preventative warfare. Because of 9/11, the US had to be on the defensive, they had to be reactive, but now they don't want to wait for another attack, they're going to be preventative. And essentially, Bush accuses Iraq of human rights violations, WMD development, and supporting al-Qaeda. And after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, a few months later, Bush declared the conflict over as Saddam Hussein was arrested and eventually executed in 2006. Another thing that sparks extreme controversy is the Abu Ghraib prison, where Iraqi prisoners were held in this American prisoner of war camp and often tortured and humiliated by Americans, which increased Iraqi resentment towards them. And the combination of conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims, anti-invasion rebellions, and jihadist terrorism that flooded Iraq all led to severe fatalities. And as the US continued to invade deeper into Iraq, the number of international protests grew. And in an attempt to withdraw from Iraq, the US gave limited political control to an interim Iraqi government. National elections were held and they established a democratic order, but ultimately this was met with relatively little success. So now let's talk about the domestic issues of the time. Bush passes the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001, which gave penalties to schools whose students did not meet the mandated federal level of performance. This was highly controversial because it directly linked standardized test scores to the funding a school received. In other words, the higher the test scores were, the more funding the school got. And although it created accountability for education, this perpetuated a cycle of poverty. Inner city schools often had low test scores, which means they got less funding, which further prevented them from getting a better education. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Meanwhile, this is kind of unrelated, but Bush has a clear victory in the election of 2004. He goes on to place 2 conservative Supreme Court judges that tried to cut New Deal liberalism by privatizing most of the Social Security benefits, but ultimately nothing really came of it. You also see that Bush attempts immigration reform by creating a bipartisan group of lawmakers to create a program for undocumented workers that would allow them to continue working while also outlining a path for citizenship. Pro-business people said that it would burden employers, and immigrant advocates said that it would treat immigrants as second-class citizens, so ultimately nothing came of the bill. However, something devastating happens when in 2005, Hurricane Katrina hits, and this hurricane killed 1,300 people, devastating the city of New Orleans, flooding most of the city and causing $150 billion in damages. FEMA and Bush didn't really do much to help, which solidified public opinion that Bush was unfit to tackle complex problems. This, along with charges of cronyism and illegal surveillance of American citizens, helped Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat, to become the first female Speaker of the House in the midterm election. So now let's talk about the election of 2008, Barack Obama. The major Democratic contenders that you should know about were obviously Illinois' first-term Senator Barack Obama and New York Senator Hillary Clinton. And despite Clinton's attacks that he was experienced, Obama actually won the election because his biracial identity proved relatable among the public and useful in the era of globalization. And his vice president was Joe Biden. Republicans, meanwhile, chose John McCain, a Vietnam War hero known for his bipartisan policies. He chose his VP to be Sarah Palin, but she soon became a liability as interviews made it evident that the former beauty queen had no grasp on current issues. In fact, she was recently on The Masked Singer, kind of weird, but I think the funniest thing is when Tina Fey portrayed her on SNL. Hilarious. Meanwhile, in the middle of campaigning, the housing price bubble burst, and the collapse of real estate prices created mortgage defaults, which led mortgage-backed securities to sink. This was caused by the Federal Reserve System's easy and abundant credit, combined with relaxed lending practices, and as a result, deleveraging took place internationally. The market crashed, marking a severe financial crisis since the Great Depression. The Bush administration quickly intervened by nationalizing, meaning taking state ownership over, the nation's biggest mortgage and insurance companies. TARP, the Troubled Assets Relief Program, wanted to give $700 billion to buy the useless assets in order to provide direct relief to the biggest banks and corporations, but it ended up only taking $21 billion. Obviously not only $21 billion, but relatively only $21 billion. Meanwhile, Obama took the opportunity to show voters that electing a Republican would lead to the same financial turmoil that they were currently in. And obviously, Obama wins the election by a strong majority because he was backed by minorities, and he took many steps to provide relief during the deepening crisis, starting with the stimulus bill. So let's talk about that. From 2008 to 2012. First, we have the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which gave trillions of dollars towards tax cuts, infrastructure projects to create jobs, and financial aid to state and local governments. And although the recession was mostly over by mid-2009, it would still take a long time to completely recover. And so because of that, Obama transitions into healthcare reform. To start off, he passes the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act in 2010. This was also known as Obamacare, and it required all Americans to have healthcare by 2014. And states had to facilitate this by creating exchanges that allowed people to purchase healthcare at competitive rates, so no healthcare monopolies. It also banned insurers from denying people with pre-existing medical conditions and allowed children to remain on their parents' healthcare plan until they were 26. Subsidies were also given to those in poverty, while funding for Medicaid also expanded. So after this, Obama shifts away from healthcare reform and focuses more on the economy, specifically with the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act in 2010. This bill would completely restructure the domestic financial regulatory system, and new controls on banks and stock markets, as well as truth in lending rules, would lead to greater consumer protection and prevented risky loan practices that had caused the Great Recession. But despite these accomplishments, Obama faced critics from both the left and the right. Since his initiatives had only stopped the economic decline and not reversed it, leftist critics said that Obama wasn't doing enough, but Republicans said that he was spending too much. So more about Obama's administration during this time. There is some resistance to his administration with the Tea Party, ultra-conservative organization, and they protested Obama's, quote, big government, calling his actions unconstitutional and socialistic. And this shows how Obama's plans for a somewhat bipartisan leadership weren't really going according to plan, as the Republican Party refused to compromise. In fact, this is exemplified when they refused to raise the debt ceiling, which is the limit for how much debt the country can go into, until a deficit reduction plan was put in place. And after many negotiations, the Republicans agreed to a raised debt ceiling, and in exchange, they got huge spending cuts with no tax hikes. Obama also inherited many foreign policy problems from Iraq and Afghanistan, on top of the economic crisis. So he created a foreign policy task force with former opponent Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. Obama hoped to repair foreign relations and reach arms agreements, and his international appeal was improved when he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009. Eventually, all forces were removed from Iraq in 2011 as promised, but Afghanistan was a bit more difficult as Obama stated that troops were necessary to defeat al-Qaeda. And although it took longer for troops to reach an agreement with the Taliban in Afghanistan, they finally tracked down and killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Eventually, troops were taken out of Afghanistan in 2011, but ground operations were replaced with attacks by air using drones. Another movement during this time is the Occupy Wall Street movement. It was a populist idea that condemned the concentration of wealth to the richest 1% of Americans and the general corporate political power. And this shows the growing discontent over the domestic financial inequality where many families could barely survive, which contrasted the generally affluent reputation of the nation. President Obama addressed these concerns, noting that shared prosperity was a significant issue. Some causes for this: there was a lot more global competition, less high-paying manufacturing jobs, a decline of unions, more part-time temporary work, and a greater education being needed for greater financial reward. So now let's talk about the election of 2012. Obama easily won for his leadership during the crisis, his healthcare reform, and for retracting from conflicts abroad. He ran against the Republican Mitt Romney, who claimed Obama's concerns about inequality were proof of promoting, quote, class warfare. And money was a big issue because of the Supreme Court case Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, which said that under the First Amendment, the government could limit political expenses made by advocacy groups, corporations, and unions. And this led to the formation of super PACs, or political action committees, which allowed them to circulate money in the political arena without providing directly to parties or candidates. So once he's elected, Obama faces another problem when Republicans once again refused to raise the debt ceiling, but unlike in 2011, Obama refused to negotiate, which led to a 2-week government closure in 2013. And after the closure ended, the Republican-controlled House agreed to a raised debt ceiling, and after the closure ended, the Republican-controlled House did agree to a raised debt ceiling. However, this raised questions about the capability of the government to function when parties were both heavily and ideologically divided. Meanwhile, Obama attempted immigrant reform with the DREAM Act, which stands for the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act, which aimed to help undocumented immigrants get citizenship if they attended college or served in the military. This, along with the other attempts that Obama made to make immigrants become citizens, did not come to fruition because the Republican House had refused to vote on it. And it shows the general anti-immigrant sentiment, especially after the recent economic crisis, that made it difficult to find jobs. In a Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Windsor, it declared the 1996 Defense of Marriage Act unconstitutional. The act had banned giving federal benefits to same-sex couples, and this, along with the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, set a precedent of more societal acceptance and greater rights for the LGBTQ community, as they should have. And finally, the World Wide Web spread throughout homes, schools, and the workplace, allowing for a rapid exchange of information, but also had the additional risk to personal security. And obviously, we'll see where that takes us in the future. But for now, that's it for this chapter. Here are the credits for how we got everything you just saw. Comment below if you have any questions. Please be sure to like and subscribe. It helps us out so much. Thank you for watching.